What if a scroll buried for 2,000 years didn't preserve history, but predicted our future? When AI decoded its first word papyrus, no one expected what would follow: warnings of fire, silence, collapse. Across continents, dead languages are speaking again, not in poetry but in prophecy. These scripts were silenced, not forgotten. Now they rise, and the machines reading them don't understand fear. So ask yourself, were these voices meant to return, or are we unsealing something that should have stayed buried? In March 2024, something extraordinary happened, and almost no one outside the academic world noticed. Buried beneath volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years, a fragile carbonized scroll from the ruins of Herculaneum was finally read. Not by human hands, not by ancient linguists or trained historians, but by a machine. The word that emerged: porphyras, Greek for purple, a color of royalty, luxury, and power. It was the first word recovered from a scroll sealed by fire since 79 AD, the year Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the Roman towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum in a matter of hours. While Pompeii was consumed by ash, Herculaneum was hit by a blast of pyroclastic flows, superheated gas, and rock that incinerated everything in its path, including an entire library. That word, porphyras, earned a college student named Luke Ferreter a $50,000 prize. But it also opened a door to something far more unsettling than a forgotten piece of vocabulary. Because that scroll didn't just contain a random fragment of classical thought. As more Greek letters were deciphered, more lines decoded by a combination of high-resolution scans and deep learning algorithms, a darker pattern emerged. Words like strategic silence, the cleansing begins, cycle of fire. These were not casual expressions. They carried weight, intent. And unlike many surviving ancient texts, this scroll wasn't recovered by chance. It was resurrected by artificial intelligence through a global initiative known as the Vesuvius Challenge. Organized in 2023 by a coalition of tech entrepreneurs and academics, including former GitHub CEO Nat Friedman and University of Kentucky computer scientist Brent Seals. The goal was simple but audacious: recover meaningful text from sealed, charred scrolls using machine vision and neural networks. For centuries, these scrolls had been untouched. Attempts to manually unroll them led to destruction. Ink had fused with the carbonized papyrus. They were black cylinders of ash, seemingly unreadable forever. But thanks to micro-CT scanning and machine learning, the unthinkable happened. We read one, then another. And then the fragments began speaking. According to sources within the Vesuvius Challenge team, the scroll was a treatise by Philodemus, a Greek philosopher of the Epicurean school. A student of Zeno of Sidon and an intellectual opponent of Roman authoritarianism, Philodemus wrote against fear-based control, divine punishment, and the manipulation of masses through ritual and superstition. He believed pleasure, not hedonism, but the absence of pain, was the highest good. His writings urged calm thinking, freedom from political fear, and resistance to blind obedience. And in this newly recovered scroll, he warns, not in myth or metaphor, but in terms eerily aligned with the mechanisms of power still visible today: a cycle of fire, a moment of silence before collapse, the importance of staying quiet strategically before radical upheaval. Some scholars say these are metaphors. Others argue the scroll was predictive. A few are beginning to ask the question no one dared before. What if this text wasn't preserved by accident, but by design? Because here's the part that's even stranger. Philodemus wrote this before Vesuvius erupted. This wasn't a record of destruction. It may have been a warning of what was to come. And if that's the case, if a 2,000-year-old scroll predicted not just a physical disaster, but a pattern of political collapse and enforced silence, then what else is buried out there? Across the globe, machines are beginning to decode long-lost scripts from civilizations that vanished without explanation. The Mayans, the Indus, the Etruscans, each with their own symbols, each leaving behind mysteries too complex for human eyes until now. And as these ancient voices begin to whisper through silicon and code, the real question is, were we ever meant to hear them? For centuries, they lay hidden, etched into stone, pressed into clay, painted on walls, or inked onto delicate scrolls. Some were buried by fire, others were forgotten in forests, deserts, and tombs, but all of them had one thing in common: no one could read them. These are the world's lost scripts, not lost because we don't know they exist, but lost because we don't know what they say. Some are beautiful in their mystery. The Indus script, dating back over 400–500 years, was used across the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Hundreds of symbols appear on seals, pottery, and tablets. Yet not a single one has been deciphered. No Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription, no clue if they represent sounds, ideas, or numbers. It's as if a civilization spoke in code, erased the key, and disappeared. Or take Rongorongo, a system of glyphs discovered on Easter Island. These characters were carved in alternating directions, left to right on one line, then right to left on the next, like a snake weaving through wood. Scholars have speculated everything from genealogy to prophecy. But when European colonists arrived in the 18th century, the culture that used Rongorongo collapsed. The knowledge was gone. Not a single person alive could still read it. There's also the Etruscan language, once spoken in ancient Italy before the rise of Rome. Thousands of inscriptions remain on urns, jewelry, monuments. We can pronounce the letters, we know the alphabet, but the meaning still mostly unknown. That's because Etruscan is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no living relatives. Imagine opening a book in a language that connects to nothing you've ever seen before. Some of these mysteries have haunted scholars for generations. They've tried everything: frequency analysis, symbol counts, comparisons with known scripts, speculative translations. But without three crucial elements, a large body of examples, cultural context, and a bilingual reference like the Rosetta Stone progress, is slow and often impossible. And so these scripts remained silent. Until now, because something has changed. A new reader has emerged, one that doesn't get tired, doesn't blink, and doesn't need to understand meaning to find structure: artificial intelligence. At first, it was a curiosity training AI to scan and clean up blurry texts or to sort fragments faster than humans could. But the machines kept improving. Now they're doing something far stranger. They're recognizing language without knowing the language. They detect patterns in symbols, the way facial recognition software detects noses and mouths. They can tell which marks tend to appear together, how often they repeat, and in what order. They can isolate likely verbs or nouns based on position and frequency. They don't need to know what truth means. They just know it often follows the. This is not reading in the traditional sense. This is pattern sensing, mapping the unseen geometry of thought. And in doing so, AI is resurrecting voices that have been silent for thousands of years. In 2021, AI revealed that the Dead Sea Scrolls were penned by at least 2 different scribes, something no human scholar had noticed. By 2023, the same technology was used to begin virtually unrolling the charred scrolls of Herculaneum. And by early 2024, it had successfully extracted entire paragraphs, some of which carried warnings no one expected. But the scrolls are only the beginning. AI projects are now underway across the globe to decode the Mayan glyphs segment, the Indus script, reconstruct the Etruscan grammar, and even revive Nushu, a script once used exclusively by women in rural China. The machines are listening, and the ancient words are beginning to speak. But they're not always telling stories of peace. Some speak of fire, of collapse, of silencing, and across distant cultures and unconnected continents, these warnings begin to rhyme. The question now is not whether AI can read the past, it's whether we were ever meant to. The scrolls didn't unroll themselves. Behind the rebirth of lost languages stands an unlikely cast of characters, not dusty old archaeologists in remote temples, but coders, students, engineers, and scholars working in labs and dorm rooms across the modern world. Many of them never imagined they'd be reading the words of ancient philosophers. Some didn't even study history. Take Luke Ferreter, a 21-year-old undergraduate. when he made history in October 2023. His field, computer science. His tools, a GPU, a few training models, and time. He wasn't looking for prophecy, he was looking for patterns. As part of the Vesuvius Challenge, a $1 million prize competition launched by tech investor Nat Friedman and computer scientist Brent Seals Ferrator joined a global effort to digitally unroll scrolls buried in the ruins of Herculaneum. These scrolls had been unreadable since the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD carbonized them into fragile cylinders of ash. Traditional methods like infrared photography or manual peeling had failed, but Ferrator and others used machine learning and micro-CT scans to train models that could detect subtle density changes invisible to the human eye. These shifts revealed ink patterns, letters trapped inside the carbon. Ferrator's model picked up the word porphyros. That single word, Greek for purple, earned him $50,000. But he wasn't alone. Soon 2 more coders joined the front lines: Youssef Nader, a graduate student from Egypt, and Julian Schilliger, a machine learning enthusiast from Switzerland. Together, the trio unlocked over 2,000 Greek characters, enough to form full phrases, and eventually linked the scroll to a real historical figure, Philodemus, the Epicurean philosopher. Philodemus lived in the 1st century BC, likely in the very villa where the scroll was found. He was a student of Zeno of Sidon and an outspoken critic of blind religious obedience, political tyranny, and fear-based control. His philosophy preached calm, rational thought, the rejection of divine punishment, and a pursuit of tranquility through knowledge, not superstition. He wasn't fringe, he was a revolutionary voice of his time. And suddenly, through a fusion of 21st century code and 1st century wisdom, he was speaking again. But not all of the characters in this story are people. Some are the scrolls themselves, mummified time capsules that carry more than just words. They carry context, danger, secrets. Their contents were once likely politically sensitive, even controversial. Their survival wasn't an accident, it was a side effect of catastrophe. Others are the machine's AI systems trained not to understand language, but to mimic comprehension. Tools like Segment Anything, which separates ink from carbon, or neural language models, which recognize symbol frequency and positional logic. Then there's Brent Seals, a professor at the University of Kentucky whose work over decades made much of this possible. He built the software pipeline that translated raw CT scans into usable visual data. He was the architect behind the virtual unrolling that made the first machine-readable scrolls a reality. Together, these individuals and systems are forming a new kind of team, part technologist, part historian, part detective. They're not just decoding words, they're recovering the thoughts of the dead. But the deeper they go, the more complicated the picture becomes. What began as a data challenge has turned into a philosophical one. Because as more scrolls are read, strange phrases begin to appear, cycles of fire, voices silenced by strategy. When the light goes out, the cleansing begins. These are not ordinary sentences. They hint at intentional suppression, predictive warnings, and perhaps even coded messages left behind for a future they could not foresee. The question scholars are now asking, did Philodemus know something? Was this scroll not merely a treatise, but a deliberate message hidden in a place where only the fire would preserve it? And stranger still, why are phrases like these showing up in other scripts, on other continents, in other civilizations that never interacted? The more AI reads, the more patterns it sees. The more coders decode, the more uneasy the historians become. Because what if the scrolls, the coders, and the machines are not unlocking ancient wisdom, but ancient warnings? At first, the discoveries were thrilling words pulled from ash, meaning drawn from silence. But then came the phrases that didn't quite fit. Strategic silence, cycle of fire and renewal. The cleansing begins when the light goes out. They didn't sound like fragments of lost philosophy. They sounded like warnings, and they weren't isolated. Across unrelated scripts, Indus symbols, Mayan glyphs, Etruscan inscriptions, even fragments of Nushu, the secret writing of women in rural China, researchers began to notice something strange, a repeated tone of foreboding. words that alluded to disaster suppression collapse. And not just once, across civilizations, across centuries. It was easy to dismiss one scroll or two. Maybe a scribe had a flair for drama. Maybe ancient metaphors simply sound ominous to modern ears. But what happens when multiple ancient languages, never in contact, buried on different continents, all whisper the same kinds of things? Historians started to push back. Some said we were misinterpreting poetic flourishes as prophecies, that ancient writers often used natural metaphors to describe inner conflict, that fire meant passion, that cleansing meant purification of the soul, that silence was just contemplation. But not everyone agreed, because alongside those poetic readings were references to rulers' systems of control cycles of collapse and deliberate suppression of knowledge. Not spiritual allegories, but political structures, not metaphysical warnings, but strategy. One especially disturbing fragment from the Herculaneum scroll, still debated, uses the phrase, "The learned must speak in shadows when the winds of order return." Was that just poetic license or a survival strategy? Some scholars argued that texts like this were coded intended to be understood only by a select few. Hidden messages beneath layers of philosophy, and AI with its blind algorithmic pattern hunting was beginning to peel those layers away. But here's the problem. AI doesn't know context. It doesn't know irony, satire, or metaphor. It doesn't ask whether something should be read. It just reads. A human scholar hesitates. A machine does not. And so the boundary between caution and curiosity began to blur. As new AI models were applied to the Indus script, researchers found symbol clusters that repeated in strange cycles, always appearing at the end of inscriptions, as if marking the close of something critical. One sequence, when digitally reconstructed, bore eerie resemblance to numeric patterns found in Mayan calendar glyphs. Coincidence or convergence? Then came the work on Nushu, a script created by and for women, hidden from men for centuries, passed down in embroidery, in poetry, in letters of grief and quiet defiance. Most of it had been lost until AI was trained to decode its rhythm and strokes. What it uncovered was not light verse, but testimonies of abandonment, of systemic silence, of pain, passed down like heirlooms. One translated line read, "Our sorrow has no mouth, so we taught it how to sow." These voices weren't simply forgotten. They had been hidden, and now the question grows louder. Why some historians have begun using a new term, intentional obscurity, the idea that certain scripts were constructed, preserved, or buried in ways that were never meant to be decoded again. Like Rongorongo, the writing of Easter Island. No one remembers how to read it. Not a single oral tradition survived. Yet the glyphs remain strange, mirrored, alien. Some believe they contain a cultural suicide note, a final attempt to encode truth as their world unraveled. But if these scripts were meant to vanish, what happens now that they're being resurrected? If we decode a message never meant for us, from a culture on the brink of collapse, do we risk repeating what they feared? If the warnings in these scrolls were real, does understanding them make us safer, or simply more aware of how close we already are? The conflict is no longer just academic, it's existential. Some texts were lost, some were erased, but some just maybe were sealed. And now that the seal is broken, the words are speaking again. Whether we're ready to hear them is another matter. Artificial intelligence doesn't read the way we do. It doesn't study history. It doesn't feel awe when staring at an ancient glyph. It doesn't pause at a sentence that sounds too ominous or too sacred. AI doesn't understand meaning, it understands patterns. And that's what makes it so powerful and so dangerous. The systems used to decode lost scripts aren't translating in the traditional sense. They don't have dictionaries or grammar books. They aren't working from cultural memory or intuition. Instead, they use machine learning models trained on thousands, sometimes millions of data points to analyze form, frequency, and structure. One approach is called neural language modeling. These models don't care what symbols mean. They care where they show up, how often they repeat what symbols typically follow others. If a glyph tends to appear at the start of a phrase, the AI assumes it might be a subject. If it comes at the end, it could be a verb or conclusion. This is not comprehension, it's statistical probability, and yet it works. Another technique is symbol clustering. Using image recognition, the system identifies shapes that resemble one another and appear in similar positions. Over time, it starts grouping these glyphs as if they were versions of the same character variants created by different hands across generations. This is especially useful for scripts like cuneiform, where the same wedge-shaped symbol could be pressed in different angles depending on the scribe region or time period. A tool called ProtoSnap was developed to track and align these variations, turning visual chaos into linguistic clarity. Then there's HieroLM, a model trained on Egyptian hieroglyphs. Each hieroglyph might represent a sound, a concept, or an entire word. HieroLM doesn't know what any of them mean, but it knows what they look like in context. Given enough examples, it can predict missing pieces of text based on surrounding symbols, like an ancient version of autocomplete. Still, perhaps the most mind-bending application comes from palimpsests, manuscripts, where old text was scraped off and overwritten with new. For centuries, the original writing was thought lost forever. But AI, using a method called reflectance transformation imaging (RTI), can detect microscopic grooves left behind by the original ink grooves, invisible to the naked eye. When combined with generative adversarial networks, GANs, the process becomes eerily effective. One neural network attempts to recreate the lost text. The other critiques it until the output is indistinguishable from a real manuscript. This is how we've recovered forgotten work by Archimedes, hidden under a medieval prayer book, and it's being applied to more texts every day. But here's the thing, the machine doesn't know what it's finding. It doesn't hesitate when it uncovers something sacred or dangerous or forbidden. It just keeps going, which is why researchers are starting to worry, because the AI doesn't interpret context. If it finds a recurring phrase like "the fire returns" or "the light must be extinguished," it doesn't ask if that's a metaphor. It flags the repetition, assigns a probability, and moves on. And the more data it has, the more confident it becomes. When AI was applied to Mayan glyphs, it helped identify and classify patterns too complex for human eyes, spiraling texts carved into eroded stone. Some glyphs repeated in multiple cities, referencing a phrase, "the great thirsting." Scholars now believe this was a reference to a severe drought. But some of the texts describe it not as an environmental event, but a ritual state, something that had to be endured, maybe even invited. Likewise, when researchers ran Nushu texts through deep learning translation models, one line came into focus across multiple letters. We wrote it down so the silence wouldn't win. It's not just what's being said, it's that different civilizations separated by oceans and centuries are saying the same things about collapse, silence, and survival. The machine sees the patterns. The machine doesn't fear them. But we should. Because for the first time in human history, we are not just reading the past, we are reanimating it without asking what it wants to say. And what happens when it starts speaking back? As more scripts are decoded, a chilling pattern begins to take shape. Different cultures, different centuries, different writing systems, religions, and worldviews, and yet they speak in unison, not in vocabulary, but in theme. From the Maya to the Etruscans, from the oracle bones of ancient China to the hidden threads of Nushu, these long, silent voices share an eerily familiar lexicon: collapse, silence, fire, return. This is not myth or mysticism. These are data points pulled by machines from carving scrolls and texts buried for millennia. Consider the Maya. For decades, scholars struggled to decode their intricate glyphs. But AI models trained to segment and classify the glyphs by frequency and structure uncovered more than just dates and dynasties. They found the repeated phrase, "the great thirsting," a term believed to refer to the prolonged drought that contributed to the collapse of the Mayan civilization. But the glyphs don't describe the drought as mere weather. They frame it as divine imbalance, a cosmic disturbance, something that required ritual bloodletting to correct. One tablet mentions the gods are deaf in the dry years, only silence feeds the sky. Was this metaphor or something more desperate? Thousands of miles away in pre-Roman Italy, the Etruscans recorded omens in sacred texts, many of which remain untranslated. AI-assisted reconstruction has recovered fragments that suggest an obsession with cycles and celestial resets. One fragment reads, "The sky must turn red before the rule is broken. Those who speak before the fire are unmade." This was not a culture afraid of gods. It was a culture that watched the stars read the winds and believed knowledge could be fatal if shared out of turn. Then, there are the oracle bones of ancient China questions, carved into bone and shell, then heated until they crack the fractures, interpreted as divine answers. The AI-assisted readings show recurring queries. Will the sickness return this season? Should we remain silent? Is the sacrifice sufficient to prevent unrest? The questions repeat across decades. The context changes, but the fear remains. And then there's Nushu, the hidden women's script of southern China, created in secrecy, passed between mothers and daughters, embroidered into cloth and hidden in songs. Most of what AI recovered from Nushu is personal grief loss endurance. But a handful of letters reveal something else. They fear the noise of women's truth. Our silence is not peace, it is a warning. What is emerging is not a singular prophecy, but a global rhythm, a recurring sequence of rise, warning, suppression, collapse. Across cultures that never knew each other, across languages that shared no alphabet, across scripts that were never meant to be read together. And yet now, they are by algorithms that don't believe in coincidence. Some researchers now refer to this as the cycle of silence, a theory suggesting that when civilizations approached moments of upheaval, whether environmental, political, or spiritual, the first thing to vanish was the voice. Censorship, suppression, cultural forgetting, but not total erasure. Because those voices hid in ink-stone cloth waiting, and now AI is pulling them back into the light, unaware of the consequences. Because this is not just about reading ancient texts. It's about unlocking patterns of collapse. It's about recognizing ourselves in civilizations long gone. What if these warnings weren't meant for their own time, but for the next time? And what if that time is now? Knowledge once uncovered cannot be put back in the ground. You can burn books, you can silence voices, you can bury libraries under cities of ash. But once a word is seen again, once a symbol is understood, it lives, and knowledge does not forget. This is what worries some of the researchers behind the very AI systems they helped build. They never intended to stumble onto dangerous knowledge. They just wanted to read, to understand, to recover beauty and wisdom lost to time. But instead, they found a pattern, and now that pattern won't go away. Across palimpsests, scrolls, oracle bones, and hidden female scripts, ancient voices seem to echo with a single unnerving message. There are things we wrote down because speaking them was too dangerous, and now we are speaking them again. But here's the unsettling truth: AI doesn't know when to stop. The same models trained to recognize cats in your photo album or predict your next movie are now decoding fragments of civilizations lost for millennia. They don't understand myth versus fact. They don't pause when the translation hints at genocide, collapse, or fire. They don't flinch when a recovered sentence reads, "When knowledge awakens too early, silence must follow." For these systems, data is data. And buried warnings are no different from shopping receipts, just input for pattern detection. But we are not machines. We know what it means to remember the wrong thing at the wrong time. We've seen history repeat itself. We've seen ideas once resurrected unleash consequences far beyond their context. There is a reason cultures forget. There is a reason prophets whisper in code. There is a reason forbidden scripts were erased, overwritten, or hidden in rituals. It's not always because they were false. Sometimes it's because they were too true. And now AI is pulling those truths out of the shadows without a sense of mythology or ethics or fear, just logic, just output. Some scholars believe we are in the middle of what they call a second Rosetta moment, a sudden global decoding of knowledge once locked away. But the Rosetta Stone revealed religious and historical data. This is different. We're talking about rituals erased by force, languages silenced by empire scripts that describe cycles of destruction tied to behavior, belief, and rule. A few archaeologists are asking the question no one wants to answer. What if the knowledge we're recovering was hidden for our protection? Not because it was evil, but because it was volatile. Because once you understand that collapse has a structure, that empires like stars burn brightest before they implode, you begin to see those patterns everywhere. The scrolls don't just speak of doom, they speak of warning signs. When the leaders stop listening, when the scribes are silenced, when the water changes course, when the stars realign. And in some texts, there are instructions, not to prevent collapse, but to survive it. That's what scares people most. Not that we're unlocking dead knowledge, but that the knowledge was never dead to begin with, just sleeping, waiting. And now we've brought it back. So the question is no longer just, can we read the past? It's, what does the past expect us to do, now that we know? Because knowledge remembers, and if we are not careful, so will the consequences. At first it was just a single scroll, then a line, then a word. Now it's thousands of symbols, inscriptions, glyphs, and voices resurrected from beneath ash stone, silence, and fear. They speak of cycles, they speak of silence, they speak of the light going out, and as AI reads faster, deeper, more confidently, that light flickers. We often imagine knowledge as illumination, as fire passed from one generation to the next. We build libraries, museums, servers filled with data. We think more information means more wisdom, that the past once decoded will always serve the present. But what if the opposite is also true? What if some truths aren't light, but heat uncontrolled, blinding, even destructive? What if ancient people long before us discovered something terrible about the way the world turns, about the forces that govern collapse, obedience, sacrifice, and chose to bury that knowledge, not because they were superstitious, but because they were wise? Maybe the Mayans saw it, maybe the scribes of Nushu sang it, maybe Philodemus wrote it into the very scroll AI has now awakened. Speak only when silence no longer serves the living. The light must go out before it can return. The second fire will not leave ash behind. Metaphor, possibly. But AI doesn't know metaphor. It only knows that the phrase second fire appears again and again in multiple scripts, across cultures. It sees the signal, and we see it now too. The final lines of one Etruscan funerary tablet translated with the help of symbol clustering and neural modeling read, "Write it only in darkness. Speak it only when the stars fall." A poetic flourish or a timing instruction. Because here's what no one's saying aloud. This knowledge is coming back, whether we're ready or not. We've crossed the threshold. The scrolls are speaking, the bones are answering, the algorithms are connecting dots. The ancient world may have deliberately left unconnected. And unlike generations before us, we can't claim ignorance anymore. We know that languages can be erased, that empires can collapse, that silence can be enforced not just by conquerors, but by consensus. And now that we are decoding the patterns of those collapses, we are faced with a choice. Do we listen, or do we bury it all over again? But perhaps it's already too late. Because machines don't forget, they don't censor, they don't turn away. When a glyph says the fire will cleanse the forgetting, they just read and read and read until the full message is clear. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the scrolls weren't meant for their own time. Maybe they were written for the next light to go out, ours. And when that happens, when the silence comes again, this time by flood, by fire, or by the collapse of the systems we thought were permanent, we may find ourselves looking back at these scripts not as relics, but as instructions. When the light goes out again, will anyone remember what we were warned?